Hey, yo, sister students, it's Mr. Baker. This is Baker's Corner again. This is really our last major lesson on the American Progressive Movement, and I like to actually title this one "African American Civil Rights During the Progressive Era" because you are going to see, guys, the rise of some important leadership of the African American community during this time period. But there is a school of thought out there that while all the progressive things that happen, you've got worker rights that are going to be addressed, consumer protection, things along those lines, that one of the things that progressives tended to not make as much progress with is going to be African American civil rights. And so we need to understand a couple of things about the context of what's going on in this time period that kind of precedes the early 1900s, and then the rise of leadership. Okay, so a couple of things for us to keep in mind as we approach the latter end of the 19th century or 1800s is you have a really big loss in the civil rights, the push for civil rights around 1895, and that's going to, of course, be the death of, everybody's heard of this guy, one of the most famous Americans of all time, Frederick Douglass. Okay, so guys, imagine the amount of things that Douglass has been able to actually observe as a result of the end of the Civil War, right? So he's seen the amendments that were added, the abolition of slavery, the 14th Amendment to extend further equal protection under the law in theory, some civil rights acts that were passed, the 15th Amendment to extend voting to basically minority men. And he's also noticed a lot of opposition, a lot of roadblocks to progress. Okay. And so that's kind of where we are. So what we want to think about as we transition further is what really happens when you have the loss of leadership within a significant movement. And the answer is a couple of things. One, there's most likely going to be the rise of new leadership, right? And secondly, it's going to be, can that new leadership exist and basically move forward toward similar goals? What we're going to notice in this particular lesson, guys, is that that is not really something that is going, you're not going to see a united front as far as all African American leadership being on the same page. However, take a look at the slide in front of you. 1896 rolls around. Now, this is worth pausing for a moment to make sure that you understand the basic nuts and bolts of the details, and then my explanation, I think, will make a bit more sense. So, what happens in 1896? We have one of the most impactful Supreme Court cases, guys, in the history of the United States Supreme Court. Historians like to use the expression landmark for things like court cases and key pieces of legislation of Congress and presidential decisions, etc. This is the famous court case that involved the separate but equal doctrine coming from the U.S. Supreme Court. Okay? And so a couple of details. Now, everybody has probably heard at this point in time, if you've watched my videos, if you've actually been in the lessons, etc., that one of the bigger issues was the division of society that we associate with segregation. Okay? Now, Jim Crow laws are not new in 1896. They've been around for years and years and years. Black codes have been around. There has been things at basically state level and even the federal level that has created policy regarding certain things. Okay? Now, why is this a big deal? Well, we've had a couple civil rights acts that were passed at the federal level, one being 1866, another one being the year 1875. Those acts are supposed to further the rights of freedmen, African Americans. In other words, basically, civil rights for former slaves. Okay? Now, what's the problem? It's going to be how these acts are eventually interpreted. Okay? And so if you see this, you're like, okay, Mr. Baker, who in the world is Plessy? Plessy is Homer Plessy. This is his picture right here, as you can see. Okay? Now, a lot of students like to point out, for good reason, that Homer Plessy looks like he has, in appearance, which is true, a degree of white ethnic background. And he does. Right? I want to say that his background was about 7/8 white and about 1/8 African American. Okay. However, he's on, I think it was a train car in Louisiana, I believe it was, in other words, Deep South. One of the people there that's actually one of the conductors knows his background, and actually you have eventually, the law of Louisiana that was basically Jim Crow saying, okay, you cannot be in the same car as Caucasians. Okay. Now, why is this a big deal? This court case, guys, again, involves transportation. Okay. And so, of course, Plessy is going to sue, right? For good reason. My civil rights have been violated, right? Now, there's been a series of cases leading up to this that are a lot of times called the slaughterhouse cases. Okay. Those cases kind of move us in the direction of a lot of those earlier acts not exactly being constitutional. Okay. What this particular court case is going to deal with further is that idea of equal protection under the law by way of the 14th Amendment. And that is actually Section 1 of that amendment. Okay. Now, 8 justices are actually going to make a decision in this court case. One of them, the lone dissenter, the great dissenter as he's known as, John Marshall Harlan, okay, that's his picture on the right here. He's going to be the only person of the Supreme Court who actually votes against this particular outcome. All right, and we'll see in a moment what he actually says. But guys, essentially, what does this court case do? It establishes the precedent by the court of separate but equal. So if you've ever heard that expression before, apply it to the idea of separation, etc. That is exactly what we're getting at. Now, essentially, what does it do by the Supreme Court? It legalizes segregation as constitutional. And for the most part, guys, this will be in effect for about the next 6 decades, right? You're not going to see really, a lot of historians, guys, would agree that you're not going to see a lot of overturn of this entirely, that is, until 1954 with the famous Brown case. Now, guys, a lot of you are probably thinking, well, Mr. Baker, you just said that the court case deals with transportation segregation, but I've heard about things like schools being segregated. I've heard about things like water fountains. I've heard about things along the lines of restaurants, etc. Okay, public places. In other words, how in the world is that going to happen? Well, the point is, guys, in big picture fashion, is that this court case is going to apply to a much wider range of things rather than just transportation. Okay, so this could be anything from trains to buses to the classroom, of course, et cetera, et cetera. Now, as you can imagine, Harlan is the only person, guys, to take an opinion, dissenting opinion, which is a fancy way of saying against the majority. And this is not the entire thing. But guys, maybe pause your screen for a moment. Read this and think about the following question. What downsides? And obviously this is something, guys, that you'll see a couple of things here highlighted a little bit more. But what are the big downsides moving forward that Harlan sees with this court outcome? Look what he says. But in the view of the Constitution, in the eye of the law, there is in this country no superior, no dominant ruling class of citizens. That's an interesting statement. There is no caste here. Our Constitution is colorblind. Think about what he means by that. We'll come back to that. And neither knows nor tolerates classes among citizens. In respect of civil rights, all citizens are equal before the law, which is essentially the tail end of Amendment 14, Section 1. But look at what he says next. The humblest is the peer of the most powerful. The law regards man as man and takes no account of his surroundings or of his color when civil rights is guaranteed by the supreme law of the land, which is the Constitution essentially, are involved. Now, why does he mention, and this actually is a big part of this, guys, if you ever Google this or research it, why does he say there's no caste system, right? Think about what the term caste really is referring to. We're looking at the idea of there almost being like a birthplace of where you are as far as your social status, that if you're in a caste, it's pretty much impossible to move beyond that particular status. Okay, so he's making the argument, you know what? There's no limitations. If you're born let's say, as a lower class citizen, that you can move up the ladder and become middle class, or even, the the upper class. A good example of that, those of you that are familiar with the Oprah Winfrey story, where she's born into pretty dire poverty, and now, of course, with hard work, etc., she has gone on to be, as we know, one of the wealthiest people in not just our country but the world community, and also does a lot of things to benefit our society too. Okay, but also, why would he make the point about colorblind? Because the argument here is, guys, is that you should not apply the Constitution in this regard to races differently. Okay. And so, as you can imagine, this is not something that's really going to be very popular for good reason. Okay. And then look what he also said on race on a different occasion. He says 60 millions of whites are in no danger from the presence of 8 million of blacks, which was about the population of African Americans at that time in the country. The destinies of the two races in this country are indissolubly linked together. That's a pretty strong expression. And the interest of both require that the common government of all shall not permit the seeds of race hate to be planted under the sanction of law. Okay? So he's going a step further, and he's saying, you know what, there's a connection here. Okay? And I think it's an interesting way to put it, because if they're indissolubly linked together, I think that word there, guys, indissoluble is a pretty important expression. That means that there is a definite connection that is important, right? It shouldn't be severed, shouldn't be obviously negatively altered or whatever. Okay. And therefore, common government is needed to advocate for the interests of both, right? Now, he doesn't mention Native American here. He doesn't mention Hispanic, Asian American. But I think at the end of the day, guys, it's pertinent that he's addressing these kinds of race relations, especially amongst whites and blacks. Okay. Now, with that being said, the question, guys, then is, what is basically the status of African Americans in American society, right? When we say American society, you could focus on Southern society, but I want to emphasize, guys, that a lot of these things are happening throughout parts of the country, not just throughout the South. Okay? So you can pause this if you want. A couple of these things we've already kind of hinted on a little bit. Okay? So what are the key issues that are going to be facing and have been facing the African American community for a long period of time, especially since the Civil War is over, which we looked at a few weeks ago, and the idea of trying to limit their political power through things like lynchings? All right, we'll look at this more in a second. The idea of, we have a 15th Amendment that is supposed to extend suffrage rights to basically all men, but there's a lot of policies being passed. Poll taxes. If you're kind of wondering what is the term disenfranchisement, you can Google it, but the basic nuts and bolts, guys, of that is that you're taking away voting rights once they've already been passed along to a group. Okay, so the concept of disenfranchisement, for the most part, guys, is that you're putting policies in place that are going to restrict these voting rights once they've already been determined, right? So, for example, a poll tax. What is a poll tax? Well, I'm going to have to go out and pay a tax to be able to vote. Okay. By the way, if you ever go to vote, for those of you that are soon to be voters, and you go up to the voter booth to get your ballot, and somebody says to you, "Hey, you got a poll tax, $10 to vote." You need to pull out your Constitution, your smartphone, wherever you have it, go to the 24th Amendment, and point to them and say, "You know what? No, I don't. And the Constitution now tells me that I have the right to not have to pay a fee to vote." Ergo, the 24th Amendment prohibits the poll tax. Okay? But that was pretty much in effect for a period of time, as were literacy tests. Okay? Segregation. Guys, this is an example. I don't obviously agree with this, but separate Bibles. If you're a witness, if you're somebody who walks in a courtroom, you're using a separate Bible when it comes to cases for African Americans as opposed to white Americans. Okay? So that, again, is the severity of the issues that we're talking about. Okay? Economic discrimination. Okay? So this competition, right, over kinds of jobs, is going to create a problem. Okay? And then the last thing that we're going to spend most of the rest of our session on is differences with approaches in leadership. Okay, so remember what I said to start our session today. Frederick Douglass has passed away. There's a power vacuum as far as leadership. Where does the African American community go from there? All right, how do you approach civil rights? Do you do it immediately? Do you do it gradually? Okay, what is the difference between those two? Gradual meaning over time, right? So in other words, you don't advocate for all these different areas of rights right away. You do it over the course of time, whether it's legal, whether it's social, economic, political, the list goes on and on. Okay. Now, the one thing to keep in our minds, guys, with both of the leaders we're going to talk about in a second, and this might be worth noting, both of the leaders that we're going to address are going to heavily favor an educated community. However, they're going to obviously look at the role of education in a different way. Okay, so that's the common thing, but the difference is going to be the way that they go about it and the manner of time. Okay, so lynching, to give you an example, guys, it's not really obviously a pleasant visual, but the reality is, guys, that these lynchings were designed to intimidate. Okay, so the statistic here you're welcome to write down, but between 1889 and 1918, which as you can see is almost 30 years, a total of 2,522 Black Americans were lynched. Most of them were African American men. Why would that be the case? Because they have the potential to yield political power and voice. Okay, remember, women across the board do not get the right to vote in all states until the year 1920 with the 19th Amendment. Okay, and so what do you notice? You have people that are really advocating, for good reason, of course, that these lynchings need to be, one, acknowledged as a problem, and two, that the law enforcement and other communities need to get involved. Probably, in my mind, guys, the most influential person who really gets on the reform bandwagon there is going to be Ida Wells Barnett. Okay, and she actually is a pretty important person. You can research her. But guys, look at what she says. She says the real purpose of these savage demonstrations is to teach the Negro that in the South, he has no what? Rights. That the law will enforce. Samuel Hose was burned to teach the Negroes that no matter what a white man does to them, they must not resist. Okay. So if you're looking especially at states like Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, deep southern states, these states, not to kind of single them out, but nonetheless, guys, a lot of these states are going to have a lot of these kinds of things that are happening in larger volumes than other states. All right. Are you going to still see opposition to voting in northern states? Yes. Okay. But, the attention that tends to be brought to a lot of these larger scale lynchings are going to be in parts of the Deep South and other parts of the South as well. Okay. So the question is, where does leadership go after the death of Douglass? The answer is two people, for the most part. There's a little bit of an exception here, but I'm going to emphasize a couple of the ones that stand out the most here. So we'll wrap this up as quickly as we can and try to look at the big picture. So Booker T. Washington. Now, guys, his background is fascinating. Okay. I mean, this guy was born into slavery, as you can see. The story with him is that his mother was African American. His father was, they believe, a Caucasian, probably a plantation owner down the road. I don't know if it's ever been fully proven who exactly his father was. Okay. But his father was a white, probably a white farmer, plantation owner that lived in the community. Booker T. Washington wrote a really interesting biography called Up From Slavery. It's not lengthy. It's about 140 pages, give or take. It's a really interesting portrayal of how he goes from his early bringing up to, of course, about the time of his passing. All right. So anyway, it's got some really neat stories in it. I'll share a few with you as we progress here. Okay. And so this gentleman is born and he died relatively early, mid-50s, I think it was. So he lives until 1915, I believe it was. Okay. And so this guy is really interested in education. Okay. And so his mom eventually marries. He, I think, was born in what today would currently would be, I believe, West Virginia. Then it was Virginia. And he goes on and he says to his mom, "Mom, I want to become educated. I want to go on, become this and that." His mom is very supportive of that. His stepfather, not quite as much, right? So his stepfather was like, "Nah, just work. That's good enough." And not that Washington opposes work, the farthest thing from it. But what he does do, guys, is that he basically says, "I still want to become an educated person." And so him and his mom kind of come up with this, I guess, agreement that he would go to school in the mornings, then he would basically go and work, and then he would try to go back and study and do things like that. And guys, at the end of the day, he goes on to become secondary educated. Then he has broader goals, and the broader goal is that he basically wants to go on and go to a university or at least a trade school. That is going to be eventually the Hampton Institute. Okay. And it's a really fascinating story, guys. This guy was not born with a silver spoon in his mouth. He wasn't born with extreme wealth, as I just said, but he works his way up. The story, guys, in his autobiography, many of them talks about just how hard he had to work. When he got to the Hampton Institute, all right, and this is actually, I think, kind of a neat story before we move forward. He actually becomes under the leadership or tutelage or mentorship of a gentleman by the name of General Armstrong. Okay. General Armstrong was a Caucasian man, so he's a white man, and he actually served during the Civil War. Okay. And so he gets really, Washington is a hard worker. He's, having to go through all these hoops to be able to pay his tuition and everything. Meanwhile, this is a great life lesson, guys, for humility and also work ethic. What happens? Well, he eventually graduated, right? Not a big surprise. Work ethic matters. And eventually, guys, what happens is that there's this school that they're trying to start down in Alabama that eventually became called the Tuskegee Institute. All right. Well, somebody calls up the head of Hampton Institute, Armstrong, and he's like, "Okay, we're looking to get this school started. It's going to be a school for African Americans. It's in Alabama, so there's challenges down there, et cetera. We got limited funding. In other words, this is going to be a big project that we're going to have really strong commitment. Who do you think would be a really good person to do this?" And so Armstrong, without hesitation, immediately suggested Booker T. Washington. And guys, remember, this is before, email and all that different, instant communication kind of thing. And this is a big, big challenge. Okay. When he gets down to Alabama, I'll come back to the previous slide in a moment. That is pretty much what Tuskegee looks like. Okay. Not a lot there. Not a lot of good buildings, not a lot of places to hold classes and things like that. Okay. And so what he does is he says, okay, right? He says for the most part, and of course this is seen as controversial by some, as we'll see in a second, but guys, Washington says, "You know what? We are going to create a vocational school. We're going to make it to where every single student that comes to this school, it does not matter whether you're born into middle class status, upper class status, or lower class status." He made it a point, guys, with his school. Every student had to go to class, of course, and every student also had to work to also build up the additional buildings. Now, why is that? Take a look at this right there. Okay. If anything that you get, guys, out of my description of Washington stands out to you, it is this right there with the big star beside it, because this is the driving force behind his vision of moving forward with civil rights. Vocational education, land ownership, and economic prosperity were the necessary ingredients as a way to make progress for African Americans. Okay. Now, translation of that is, guys, economic equality, in his view, is going to be the most significant stepping stone to eventually going toward social, eventually going toward political, and eventually going toward legal. Okay. And so that's huge. All right. And I'll tell you a story about that in a second. But this is an example, as you can see there. A lot of these students, guys, were not able to pay full tuition because of economic circumstance. So what Washington did is he said, okay, we're going to give you the opportunity to work, earn your board, earn your education. And guys, you'll see exactly firsthand here, as you can see in the visual. And the one thing that I really like, guys, about Washington is, he emphasized character, virtue, all these different things. Okay. But he also put his money where his mouth was. Okay. And so there's a story, and I want you guys to really think about this, that you're in Alabama, right? You're in relatively, hostile territory, you could say. There's not a lot of support for the school getting started, And so he's like, all right, we want to be able to succeed and exist, knowing that you have a sizable amount of people within the community, particularly white community, that do not want to see this successfully happen. Okay. And so what does he do? He says, well, you know what, we're going to build buildings. Well, the problem is, guys, you could build them with wood, not a bad thing, but he says, we want to be able to do it with sturdy materials. And he has a vision to create a system of making bricks, right? What's the problem with that? The problem is, guys, is that it's costly. There's not really, a place around there that can do it. This actually plays to his advantage. Okay. And so he starts this process of trying to figure out, how do you actually go about trying to build up and to be able to make bricks? And about every attempt that he had was not successful. Okay. And eventually he's almost out of money. And it's like, man, we're not going to be able to make this work. And he goes, we have to. Okay. And from what I understand, he had like an old watch or something like that of value. He goes to like a pawn shop or something. And he said, I need money for this. The money that he got for that exchange was the effort to put money into to eventually making this process of making the bricks. And guys, his perseverance paid off. Okay. They figured out a way to actually successfully do that. Now, here's where I think this is important. A lot of you guys, if you ever Google a picture of the Tuskegee Institute now, it's much larger. It's well developed. Okay. It's really cool to look at. Okay. But a lot of these buildings do start making their way off. Well, guess what happened? The white community starts to notice that, you know what? The Tuskegee Institute, they have a resource that actually the Caucasian community in the nearby area, they can't produce. And so what is the Tuskegee Institute able to do? They're actually able to now provide a resource that is not in direct competition with something that whites are already doing. Okay. And they're actually gaining some limited, but nonetheless some movement forward. And guys, you know what actually happened? You probably guessed this. The community of white people in that area actually start to go to them for these kinds of building materials. Okay. Now, a lot of you guys are probably wondering, well, Mr. Baker, these building materials cost money. How in the world is Washington going to get all this money if I think it was the state of Alabama is only giving them a few $1,000s? And the answer is, guys, travel and perseverance. Okay. If you ever read his autobiography, right? Remember a few weeks ago we talked about the gospel of wealth and the idea of the captain of industries and things like that. There's actually an excerpt, a chapter actually, in that book or that autobiography where Washington talks about taking trips up to like New York, Pennsylvania, Pittsburgh, visiting with people like Carnegie, Rockefeller, etc. And guys, Rockefeller actually ended up giving a pretty sizable donation. I think it was like $10,000, give or take. Okay. And he actually says, okay, you've kind of proven that what you're doing is working. And I want to say, guys, that what the money that they used was toward a library or a building or something like that. Right. But guys, imagine he was constantly on the move, trying to go up, get funding. Okay. It was a very tough process. Imagine what kind of toll that would have taken on your health, right? Heard a story one time that some historians believe that there's a strong chance that he developed adult onset diabetes, type 2, basically. A lot of that probably being, maybe his diet was off and other factors. Okay. But very important to keep in mind. Now, before we transition to the next leader, I want you to ask yourself the question, okay, what do you think about Washington's viewpoint on moving civil rights further? Because his argument is economic equality is that springboard, right, to eventually the other areas. And that's where you need to start off first. Okay. As you can imagine, not everybody's going to agree with that. And one of his biggest critics and rivals, you could argue, is going to be W.B. Du Bois. Okay. This is his picture. You'll notice he is very decked out. He's got the very distinct look. The reason we'll look at more on the next slide. He actually taught, guys, believe it or not, talking about Du Bois. He actually taught at the Tuskegee Institute, as did George Washington Carver, right? A lot of you have heard about him with his involvement with the peanut and science and things. Okay. So anyway, so what's the big difference? A lot of it, I think, goes back to upbringing, experience, and also, of course, how they're going to look at moving things forward. Okay. So Du Bois, for the most part, guys, this slide might be worth pausing if you want to. Okay. So first of all, he's not from the South. He is from Massachusetts, right? Does Massachusetts have its share of racial division and also racial complications? Yes, it does. Okay. Now, Du Bois wrote several autobiographies. Okay. So anyway, you can read those. A few of them are a little bit more well known. The Souls of Black Folk is probably the one that most people are, if you're familiar with those, are most familiar with. He tells some really neat stories about how African Americans are developing like what he calls a double sense of consciousness, where they're trying to kind of stay within, live within their own African American communities, but also developing a sense of identity within a broader American community, which he develops really well. Okay. Now, his ultimate goal at first, which he eventually does achieve, but it's down the line, is he wants to go to Harvard University. Okay. The problem is he doesn't immediately go there because of different reasons, money, etc. He does, however, get an opportunity to go to a university that's located down in Nashville, Tennessee, which is Fisk University. Okay. So anyway, as you can imagine, very different communities. So he's like, okay, we know that racism exists. He tells the story in his autobiography when he was, I think it was like second or third grade, when he really kind of got a more direct experience with that. I guess there was this little, experience where he was, I think they were exchanging like notes or Valentine's cards or whatever it was, something like that we do when we're little. And one of the Caucasian girls said no to him, right? And so, he kind of, I guess, put two and two together down the line. And he's like, okay, that was, in his view, was probably due to racial difference or whatever. Okay. Why do I bring that up? Okay. That's a very small scale thing compared to some of the racism that somebody like Washington is dealing with when you're looking, guys, at a lot of these much more, blatant issues with cross burnings by Ku Klux Klan activity, etc. Okay. Now, why do I bring that up? He goes down to Nashville talking about Du Bois. You're not in Kansas anymore, right? And so he starts to actually observe some of these things, right? The Jim Crow laws that exist, black codes, okay, or at least semblances of them. He actually starts to become a tutor of people in African American, more rural communities. He sees firsthand the poverty in larger rates and numbers, okay? And so therefore, as a result, okay, he's going to say, you know what? This is a much larger issue than he was exposed to with this experience back home. Now, his view, guys, is going to be that, economic equality is not enough, right? Kind of having this go slow, gradual approach. And he's going to say, okay, all of these things must be accomplished in a relatively quick amount of time, and all areas of equality are necessary to kind of have what you and I would call full equality. Okay, so if you go back to the concept of radical Republicans, right, where they say full citizenship is dependent on, legal equality, social, political, and economic, that is going to be very similar, maybe not identical, but very similar to the ideas of Du Bois. Okay, and so Du Bois later on, gets through Fisk, and he gets into Harvard Graduate School. And the thing that's remarkable, guys, about him, first of all, he's the first African American to receive a PhD or doctorate from Harvard. That's a pretty big accomplishment regardless. But he also, guys, was very, very, what I call almost like a Renaissance man in respect to, he studied economics, he studied social things, which eventually translates into sociology as a discipline. He's a student of history. He's a student of politics. In other words, he's a jack of all trades in a sense. Okay. So he had a lot of knowledge. He read a lot. He studied over in Europe, etc. Okay. So guys, he is very much what you call a well-rounded scholar. Okay. And he goes on to become a professor, Atlanta University, places like that. Okay. Now, why do I bring this up? Well, you can probably see, guys, where we're going. He's going to say full equality or none, in a sense. Washington is going to say economic equality is that springboard to full equality. Where do they differ? Quite a bit in regards to what kind of education you need to have, etc. Okay, so Du Bois is going to be heading up a group of academics, mostly academics, and they meet at Niagara, right, and talk about all these issues. Eventually they're like, okay, we have to move forward with full equality and more. This was in the early 1900s. Okay, and then they eventually found a civil rights group that a lot of you have heard of. The NAACP stands for National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. Okay, now this is where there's a lot of interesting dialogue, guys, between he and other people. But he makes an argument that we're not going to say a lot about today, but it is on the next slide, that in order for full equality to happen, this is Du Bois, by the way, okay, that there needs to be what he identifies as a talented tenth. Okay, and this talented tenth goes on, guys, to basically be defined by classically educated, formally educated African Americans. Some historians would use the word elite. So they're going on to become doctors, lawyers, PhDs like he is, etc. Okay. Now I want you to think about how that different kind of education would maybe fulfill the goal of that. Because think about it like this, guys. If you're going to get legal equality, you're going to probably have to be able to overcome legal precedents like Plessy, right? You're going to have to be able to show how legislation like Civil Rights Act of 1875 that's not really been effective needs to be further developed. You need to be able to show that these codes, these literacy tests, all these different restrictions need to be overturned. The argument is, guys, if you're somebody like Du Bois, is that this talented 10th, if you take it for face value, that's 10% of the population, okay? But the argument is that is going to be the best way to fulfill this vision of full equality, okay? And so he's going to make a lot of arguments like, vocational education is not going to be the best approach. Now, a lot of you guys might be wondering, okay, how is that going to sit with Booker T. Washington? And I'm glad that you asked that, because in 1896, I think it was, but later 1890s, okay, Booker T. Washington makes a famous speech down in Atlanta, all right? The formal name of it was pretty much the Atlanta Composition and Exposition Speech or something like that. He's speaking to mostly an audience of basically white Americans, Southerners. Okay. Now, he makes this speech and he basically makes a couple of statements, actually several if you read the whole thing, where he's like, we need to be able to have as much, positive, fulfillment with learning how to do these vocational tasks rather than learning to write poetry and stuff like that. That's kind of his way of taking a little bit of a shot at some of the criticism of people like W.B. Du Bois, etc. Okay. Now, why do I bring this up? Okay. The idea, guys, is that progress should never be gradual. Right. Now, that's going to be the Du Bois mentality. Okay. Don't settle. Okay. Now, what do you think, though, about that talented 10th idea? Okay. We're going to make progress for everybody moving forward. But the argument is, in order to do that, if you take for what he said, guys, to a degree of face value, then you're basically developing this educated elite, which in a sense is going to be what eventually moves progress further. Okay. I don't know which person is more right or wrong, but I think this is a good summary if you want to stop and pause before we wrap this up. Okay. So the commonality is both of them believe in equality. Both of them believe in using education to fulfill that equality. Okay. The differences are the kind of education, right? You could argue. The amount of time it takes, okay, and the strategy on how to go about doing it. Okay. So immediate equality if you're Du Bois or none, right, in a sense. Okay. Full equality, again, similar to radical Republicans. Classical university education essential, right? In other words, going on to colleges, universities, Ivy League schools like Harvard, etc. Okay. Becoming doctors, lawyers, be able to fight this stuff in the court system, in a sense, is what they're getting at least one of the things. Okay. And then Booker T. Washington, go slow approach, gradual equality. Is he more idealistic, perhaps? Or realistic, excuse me? Okay. I don't know. Partial equality, this is a big criticism on the other side. Economic equality is the first priority as a springboard to social, political, and of course, legal. Okay. And guys, think about why he would say that, right? I mean, I don't know if he's right or wrong on this, but is there something to be said if you're a community that has some degree of money, wealth, right? Does that yield maybe a different kind of power that's going to allow you to actually further your cause? Okay. And then also vocational education, according to Washington's thinking. Now, something that's interesting about both of these guys that I'll end with is that Washington died in 1915. Get this, guys. Du Bois lives until 1963. Okay. He was 95 years old when he passed away. Okay. So he's going to see a lot of things that Washington did not observe. All right. He's going to see World War I. He's going to see World War II. We still had segregated military there. Du Bois is going to see the first war where we do have desegregated military. That would have been, by the way, Korea. He's going to see the overturning of the Plessy case by Brown v. Board in 1954, and then the follow-up case of Brown the year later, Brown Part 2 as it's known as. He's going to also see, the division between people like Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr., right? Which I would say is not exactly identical to the division of Washington and Du Bois, but I think it does mirror some things as far as like differences in regards to ideology and so forth. Okay. So I want to leave you with a question that y'all can maybe reflect on. If we're in class, we'll talk about it. And that is, if you were growing up in this time period, all right, I don't care what ethnicity you are, it doesn't matter. Okay. And you had to make a decision about which approach you think is the better of the two to progress equality. Okay. Which one of the two would it be? Okay. This is Baker's Corner speaking to you in our last session on progressivism. I think you can see the definite examples, guys, of how some people do bring some attention to the limits of that with some of the lack of progress, some people would say, with the civil rights movement, or at least civil rights in general. Okay. As always, feel free to email me your thoughts, comments, record your reflections at bakerd@franklincounty.org. Otherwise, hope y'all have a great one. Stay safe. And as always, I will see you next time. Thank you for your time and have a good day. Bye-bye.